For many South Africans are still trying to process these attacks. We're asking, is it xenophobia or something more complex? Let's get some perspective at where we are at the moment with Michael Marillier. He's been working that angle for us. So, Michael, you're looking at a survey on the quality of life in Gauteng. What have you seen in that survey? What have you picked out?
Yeah, so one of the questions, Uveka, was what is the biggest problem in your community or in your neighborhood? So really the research is asking people to identify what really irked them, what really made their lives more difficult. And top of the list, of course, was crime, and behind that was unemployment. And interestingly enough, research is also asking about foreigners. Were they concerned about the foreigners living in their community? Just 2% of Gauteng residents identified foreigners as a so-called problem, and as we mentioned, way off compared to crime, which registered a 32% response rate. In fact, socio-economic issues really dominating this particular survey. If you look at unemployment, 18%. If you look at lack of basic services, 10%, and the high cost of living, 4%. All of them much higher, Uveka, than foreigners. Of course, it all begs the question, then why do we see these attacks every once and a while? Analysts are saying, really, that foreigners often are in minority in communities, and so they become easy targets. So when the frustration grows around unemployment and crime and access to opportunities, all of this gets conflated, and foreigners tend to bear the brunt of that frustration. That's what some analysts are saying about the reasons behind the violence that we've seen over the last few days.
And as we've seen, Michael, all it takes is one person to sort of light that spark, and then you have somebody in authority, like a mayor or a police chief, you know, fueling that or saying something like, and it just doesn't help. Now, let's talk about socioeconomic issues. And I asked this question a lot last week when this happened about socioeconomic. Even when the president spoke, did he talk about let's go to those communities where these frustrations must be at their height? And they often play a role. Give us some context about how desperate are people in these communities? What is their plight? What are their situations?
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, we're not saying that because a community might be poor or might be a lower LSM that suddenly we're going to see protests. But we do get some sense of idea of the issues that are playing themselves out, Uveka. So this is basically a ward map of Gauteng. And what you're looking at here, Uveka, is the mean income per ward. So whenever you see a ward that is light green to dark green, it's doing relatively well economically. When we say relatively well, an average income of about 18,000 Rand, perhaps a little bit more when it's dark green. When it's light green, it's about 8 to 18,000, so not a lot when you consider it in those terms. Whenever you see a red or an orange, Uveka, those are really communities that are struggling financially and economically. And as you can see, if you just take a look at that map, we saw protests predominantly in the CBD of Johannesburg, as well as the southern part of the city, and to some extent the western part of the city. And most of those wards, Uveka, are areas which are socio-economically a little bit unstable. They're not doing particularly well financially, and so perhaps the city may want to keep an eye on those. We also saw some unrest in Tshwane, and as you can see, large swaths of that part of the province are in the red. That means, Uveka, an income of, well, less than 3,200 Rand on average. So something to keep an eye on as government tries to manage the fallout from this violence.
And figure out exactly who's behind all of this and get there. Well, thanks very much, Michael Marillier, just looking at that survey, explaining what could be causing people to act the way they do.